Hello. All right, this video here, we're going to start off subpart I, which is PPE. Now, the reason why we're going to cover this in pretty much in depth, this whole subpart, because this is the entire subpart of OSHA that covers PPE specifically. Now, it's covered kind of in other places in a lot of different ways, but this is the one that's just for PPE. So we're going to cover it pretty extensively. Why? Because in the hierarchy of controls, PPE is one of the main things in it. Even though it's the last line of defense, it's still an important one because a lot of times that's all you can do. So we're going to get started with this one right now. This is 1910.132. This is the general requirements of this section here. So this, again, this section here is subpart I. Yeah, we'll get going here as soon as this decides to cooperate. All right. So you can see this is if you look it up on the OSHA website, this is what you're going to see. The very first part of any of these standards, you're going to see this heading. It tells you 1910 subpart I, personal protective equipment, and this particular standard 1910.132, and it's called general requirements. Application: protective equipment, including personal protective equipment for eyes, face, head, and extremities, protective clothing, respiratory devices, and protective shields and barriers shall be provided, used, and maintained in a sanitary and reliable condition wherever it is necessary by reason of hazards of processes or environment, chemical hazards, radiological hazards, or mechanical irritants encountered in a manner capable of causing injury or impairment in the function of any part of the body through absorption, inhalation, or physical contact. I think it's a pretty long sentence, isn't it? Employee-owned equipment. Where employees provide their own protective equipment, the employer shall be responsible to assure its adequacy, including proper maintenance and sanitation of such equipment. So this happens sometimes. The employee says, okay, I've got these great ear protection and that's what I'm going to use. I like them and I've had for a long time. So that's fine. Can they use them? Sure they can. But the employer is still responsible to ensure that the hearing protectors are adequate, they're being properly maintained and being kept clean. So that's kind of a put you in a position where you're going to have to make sure the employee understands this, and they're going to have to let you, the employer, know about it, that they are doing this and properly maintaining it. Maybe they have a log or something they have to do, some kind of maintenance log. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there, because they're using their own, they're happy with it. You want your employees to be happy, but you also have to make sure you're covered yourself in this by the standard 132, 1910.132B here. Design: all personal protective equipment shall be of safe design and construction for the work to be performed. That makes a little bit of sense, doesn't it? I mean, who wants unsafe PPE? Hazard assessment and equipment selection. The employer shall assess the workplace to determine if hazards are present or are likely to be present, which necessitate the use of personal protective equipment. If such hazards are present or likely to be present, the employer shall select and have each affected employee use the types of PPE that will protect the affected employee from the hazards identified in the hazard assessment. Communicate selection decisions to each affected employee and select PPE that properly fits each affected employee. Note, non-mandatory Appendix B contains an example of procedures that would comply with requirements for a hazard assessment. And we're going to talk about Appendix B later on, not in this video. The employer shall verify that the required workplace hazard assessment has been performed through a written certification that identifies the workplace evaluated, the person certifying that the evaluation has been performed, the dates of the hazard assessment, and which identifies the document as a certification of hazard assessment. Now, this is something that's important. This is something that OSHA's going to look at if they come knocking on your door. All this is telling you need to go out there, and it's what we do. You look at a plant and say, okay, well, we have this, and this. We have loins over here. We have welding over here. We have forklifts. So we have hazards. So forklifts would be a PPE thing, but anything where PPE is required, and you have to say the safety glasses grinding, let's say, you say, okay, these people need to wear this, and this people need to wear that. In this area, we need to have hearing protection. And you don't have to get real detail in this, but you have to do an assessment of the workplace and determine what PPE is needed where, and then you can go from there. But until you do that, you kind of flying blind. So instead of doing it haphazardly, you want to do an assessment of your entire workplace. And then, of course, follow up on that. Defective or damaged equipment. Defective or damaged personal protective equipment shall not be used. That's pretty simple. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. They're saying you just can't use it, which is a good idea. Training. The employer shall provide training to each employee who is required by this section to use PPE. Each such employee shall be trained to know at least the following. So the employee has to know at least these things: when it's necessary, when they should use it, what PPE is necessary, how to properly don, doff, adjust, and wear it. So don means put on, doff means take off. So don and doff, on and off, adjust and wear it. So they got to know this. The limitations of the PPE. In other words, they have to know that, okay, that this is what it can do, but this is what it can't do too. And the proper care, maintenance, useful life, and the disposal of the PPE. So they have to know all that stuff. Each affected employee shall demonstrate an understanding of the training specified in the preceding paragraph and the ability to use PPE properly before being allowed to perform work requiring the use of PPE. So they got to demonstrate that they understand what the training that they were given and then know what they're doing. Does that make sense? Of course it does. Now, something like hearing protection, that's pretty easy, pretty quickly. But something like welding or something like that, that's a little different. But to make sure that they have to demonstrate the understanding. When the employer has reason to believe that any affected employee who has already been trained does not have the understanding and skill required by paragraph F2 of this section, the employer shall retrain each employee. Circumstances where training is required include, but are not limited to, situations where the changes in the workplace render previous training obsolete. Changes in the types of PPE to be used render previous training obsolete, or inadequacy in an affected employee's knowledge or use of assigned PPE indicate that the employee has not retained the requisite understanding or skill. In other words, they show they don't know after you train them, they show they still don't understand what's going on. So then you need to retrain them. Paragraphs D and F of the section apply only to sections which we haven't covered yet: 10.133, 135, 136, 138, 140, and they don't apply to 134 and 137. And the reason for that, 134 is respiratory protection, 137 is electrical, and those are pretty long sections. The other sections are all pretty short. Payment for protective equipment, except as provided by paragraphs H2 through H6 of this section. The protective equipment, including personal protective equipment, used to comply with this part shall be provided by the employer at no cost to employees. Now, we've talked about this before. Well, maybe I haven't talked to you about this before, but it's come up before in other classes about this. There are some exceptions to this. And of course, let's go through H2 through H6 before we get into it. The employer is not required to pay for non-specialty safety toe protective footwear, including steel-toed shoes or steel-toed boots, and non-specialty prescription safety eyewear, provided that the employer permits such items to be worn off the job site. Now, the safety eyewear I get, but the safety shoes, you know what? You can do that if you want to, but these are your employees, and you can treat your employees one of two ways. A company can. They can treat them as expenses, or they can treat them as assets. If they can treat them as expenses, they probably don't care much about them too much. If they can treat them as assets, they want to keep them. They want to keep them safe. So I would think that you have a pretty good policy on this, where you pay for it, even if you're not required, like steel-toed shoes. So the safety eyewear, that's a little different thing, because that's special. Only you can use that. That's what they're getting at here. But non-specialty, in other words, it's something they could use anywhere. So we had a problem with OK Foods in our safety program, our safety footwear program. They weren't allowed to get shoes that were camouflaged, because what happened was they would get safety boots that were camouflaged, and they wouldn't wear them to work. They'd save them for hunting. So they weren't allowed to get camouflaged. When the employer provides metatarsal guards and allows the employee at his or her request to use shoes or boots with built-in metatarsal protection, the employer is not required to reimburse the employee for the shoes or boots. So if we're going to provide metatarsal, that's one that goes on the top of your foot guards, and the employee would rather have one that has them built in, well, then they can buy that on their own if they want to. You don't have to reimburse them for it. The employer is not required to pay for the logging boots required by 29 CFR 266, which logging, which we're not going to cover, that's not general industry. Everyday clothing, such as long sleeve shirts, long pants, street shoes, and normal work boots. This comes in sometimes under arc flash, because you have to wear sometimes long sleeve shirts, and have to be cotton for arc flash, and cotton t-shirts, but the employer doesn't have to pay for those because they're just regular everyday clothing. Ordinary clothing, skin creams, or other items used solely for protection from weather, such as winter coats, jackets, gloves, parkas, rubber boots, hats, raincoats, ordinary sunglasses, and sunscreen. So what they're saying here is, if somebody has to go out and work outside a little bit, unless it's really dire circumstances, you don't have to give them winter coats and jackets and gloves. They should be able to provide that for themselves, because they can wear that stuff on the way to the store or whatever when they're home, and when they're going out on their own too. So ordinary sunglasses, notice that says that, ordinary sunglasses. So now you can, if you want to, and some people, sometimes it's done, but the employer can, but they're not required to. The employer must pay for replacement PPE except when the employee has lost or intentionally damaged the PPE. Okay, so the replacements, employer comes up, employees, here's these my headphones that I got yesterday, and they're busted in half. He said, well, wait a minute. That looks like intentional damage. How did that happen? Oh, they fell off the bottom of my pickup truck. Well, you know what? A car ran them over. Well, you did that intentionally. You should have kept them inside. You don't have to pay for them. Now, like with your regular earplugs, you go in, they're pretty cheap. You want to be reasonable. They're going to let loose sometimes, but if it's once every 6 months or so, I don't think you'd worry about it. If it's every day, that's a different story. So you got to take that case by case a little bit. But you're not required to pay for PPE except, you're not required to pay for PPE that the employee has lost or intentionally damaged. If they come up and just says, I can't find my PPE, well, then they might have to buy some more. But now you can't let them go to work without it. So you better have it there. And if they don't pay for it, then now you're going to have to either get it later or not let them go to work. So where an employee provides adequate protective equipment he or she owns pursuant to paragraph B of this section, the employer may allow the employee to use it and is not required to reimburse the employee for that equipment. The employer shall not require an employee to provide or pay for his or her own PPE unless the PPE is accepted by paragraph H2 through H5 of this section, which we just covered. This paragraph shall become effective on February 13, 2008. Employers must implement the PPE payment requirements no later than May of 2008. Where the provisions of another OSHA standard specify whether or not the employer must pay for specific equipment, the payment provisions of that standard shall prevail. So if there's something in another standard that covers this, that will override this standard. That's all for 1910.32. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop this video. All right, here we go. Now we're back. How about that? With 1910.133. I'm going to put these two together because they're pretty short. 1910.133 is pretty short, like 10 slides or so. So this is called eye and face protection. There you go. There's your header. So general requirements. The employer shall ensure that each affected employee use appropriate eye or face protection when exposed to eye or face hazards from flying particles, molten metal, liquid chemicals, acids or caustic liquids, chemical gases or vapors, or potentially injurious light radiation. The employer shall ensure that each affected employee uses eye protection that provides side protection when there is a hazard from flying objects. Detachable side protectors, clip-on or slide-on side shields meeting the pertinent requirements of this section are acceptable. The employer shall ensure that each affected employee who wears prescription lenses while engaged in operations that involve eye hazards wears eye protection that incorporates the prescription in its design, or wears eye protection that can be worn over the prescription lenses without disrupting the proper position of the prescription lenses or the protective lenses. Eye and face PPE shall be distinctly marked to facilitate identification of the manufacturer. The employer shall ensure that each affected employee uses equipment with filter lenses that have a shade number appropriate for the work being performed for protection from injurious light radiation. The following is a listing of appropriate shade numbers for various operations. And we're not going to get, it's sheet metal, shielded metal arc welding, gas metal arc welding, tungsten welding. There's different shields, protective shades on that. And so we're not going to get into the details of that, but you need to know that it's there. And that when they're talking about radiant energy, they're basically talking about welding and cutting, plasma cutting, torch brazing, all that type of thing. And there's your different ones too, and protective shades for tighten the thickness against the filter lenses. As a rule of thumb, start with a shade that's too dark to see the weld zone. Then go to a lighter shade, which gives sufficient view of the weld zone without going below the minimum. In oxy-fuel gas welding or cutting where the torch produces a high yellow light, it's desirable to use a filter lens that absorbs the yellow or sodium line in the visible light of the spectrum. These values apply where the actual arc is clearly seen. Experience has shown that the lighter filters may be used when the arc is hidden by the workpiece. Criteria for protective eye and face protection. Protective eye and face protection devices must comply with any of the following consensus standards: 1910.33b1 I, ANSI-ICA Z87.1-2010, Occupational and Educational Protective Eye and Face Protective Devices, incorporated by reference 1910.6. So this is basically your Z87 here. Protective eye and face protection devices that the employer demonstrates are at least as effective as protective eye and face protection devices that are constructed in accordance with one of the above consensus standards will be deemed to be in compliance with the requirements of this section. Now that the employer demonstrates, so none of that doesn't say that the employer has to wishes it or has it written down that it is or would like it to be. You have to demonstrate that they're at least effective as a protective eye and face protection there. So you just can't say it is. It has to, you have to be able to demonstrate it. And that's it for 1910.33 eye and face protection. So these two standards, 1910.32 and 33, are pretty short, so I lumped them together. And the next one's going to be a doozy, 34. I'm going to cover the rest of them on that. And after that, 34, 30, 134, 137 are pretty long. The other ones are pretty short. So that's it. We're going to cover this entire just about the entire subpart I in these videos here. So be safe.